man found what the rest of us can no longer comprehend: solitude in nature. So, again, this is a contemporary article about a man who lived alone for 27 years in the woods. You are focusing on how this text reflects the ideals of the romantic period and the transcendental period. This is by Nathan Rich. It appeared in The Atlantic in 2018. In the 27 years he lived in the Maine woods, Christopher Knight said a single word. Because he never spoke to himself and avoided humanity with the guile of a samurai, he went decades without using his voice. In his hidden forest encampment, he laughed silently and he sneezed silently. So fearful was he of being discovered. The only time he spoke came at some point in the 90s when he was surprised by a hiker during a walk. "Hi," Knight said. The hiker barely looked up, not realizing he was face to face with the legendary Hermit of North Pond. Since his arrest in April 2013, Knight has agreed to be interviewed by a single journalist, Michael Finkel, published an article about him in GQ in 2014, and now has written a book, A Stranger in the Woods, that combines an account of Knight's story with an absorbing exploration of solitude and man's eroding relationship with the natural world. Though the stranger in the title is Knight, one closes the book with the sense that Knight, like all seers, is the only sane person in the world gone insane, that modern civilization has made us strangers to ourselves. Finkel first wrote to Knight at the Kennebunk County Jail after the Hermit's capture became a national news story. Hoping to ingratiate himself, Finkel sent several of his articles, including one in National Geographic about the hunter-gatherer tribe in the remote Rift Valley of Tanzania. Knight responded to Finkel's letter with one of his own. It contained a photograph ripped from the Tanzania article, a portrait of a tribal elder named Anwas, who has lived his entire life in the bush. Though Anwas camped with his family, he passed vast reaches of time in silent isolation, measuring his days by the cycle of the moon. For more than 2 million years, or nearly all of human existence, this is how our genius lived. This, writes Finkel, is who we truly are. In the course of their fragmentary, troubled relationship, Knight helps Finkel grasp the profound implications of his statement. If deep down we are all Anwas, then what, God help us, have we become? Finkel calls Knight's case almost certainly the biggest burglary case in the history of Maine, which may be a touch too fine. A year after Knight's arrest, for instance, two 19-year-olds stole more than $200,000 from a house in the island town of Vinalhaven. Maine fishermen tend not to trust banks. Knight, by his own estimation, engineered 40 break-ins a year and more than 1,000 in total before he was caught stealing marshmallows and Humpty Dumpty chips from the commissary of a camp for kids with disabilities. This was his typical haul. Most of his break-ins netted loot like boxed macaroni and cheese, Mountain Dew, propane tanks, tarps, and novels. Knight stole what he needed to survive. He accumulated $395, most of it in singles, in case of an emergency, but he never spent a dollar. Some of his bills had become moldy. Knight's successful string of burglaries is among the least astonishing details of his story. At the age of 20, after earning a high school diploma and a vocational degree, he quit his job as an alarm technician and took a road trip down to Florida. On his return, he drove past his childhood home in Albion, a small village northeast of Augusta, halfway between China and Freedom, and continued 100 miles north until he nearly ran out of gas on a small dirt road. He entered the woods like a suicide, leaving his keys inside the car. He had no destination nor map. He carried a tent, but had never spent a night in one before. Most of his family members and friends assumed that he had died. In one sense, they were right. He drifted for weeks, walking south, stealing food from people's gardens. By the time he discovered an ideal site, shielded by boulders and dense forest between two ponds, steps away from the nearest of dozen summer camps in the area, he was just 30 miles from his parents' house, though he didn't know it. This site, Finkel's notes, had good cell reception. He had an eye for ambient details that reflect his subject's character. The geological term for the kind of boulders that shield Knight's sight was erratic. The lines of writing in his letters are crowded together as if for warmth. The car he abandoned at the edge of the forest is by this point as much a part of the wilderness as a product of civilization. Knight took extreme measures to defend his isolation. He never lit an open fire, and he devised trails over rocks and roots to avoid leaving any footprints. Taking advantage of his alarm system expertise, he disabled surveillance cameras, spied on homes for days to learn their owners' habits, and restricted his raids to weeknights when the cabins were most likely to be unoccupied. Once inside, he looked for spare keys and stashed them elsewhere on the property to enable future break-ins. When he borrowed a canoe to paddle on properties across the pond, he made sure, upon returning it, to sprinkle it with pine needles to give the impression that it had never been moved. His actions are so stealthy and his bounty so niggling that for decades residents believed that the North Pond Hermit was a myth. There was willful ignorance on both sides. Knight did not learn the name of the pond he haunted until he was arrested, or the nearest town, Rome. He claimed to have been ignorant of the year and even the decade. He kept time like Anwas does. The moon was the minute hand, he tells Finkel, the season, the hour hand. What kind of man does a thing like this? What kind of man talks like this? An autodictat, for starters, with the attendant traits, overly formal speech. Asked about his survival methods, Knight replies, I have woodscraft, narcissism, you're my boss, well, he tells Finkels, and quaky insecurity. In a conversation about literature, he defiantly tells Finkel that he refuses to be intellectually bullied into finishing Ulysses, despite the fact that he has not encountered an intellectual or a bully in 27 years. One can have a genetic disposition for solitude, Finkel notes, and Knight came from a family of loners. He tells Finkel that he had missed some of his family to a certain degree. But genes cannot explain the extraordinary rigor of Knight's renunciation. Finkel plumbs the history of hermits for a similar case, considering Lao Tzu, the anchorites of the Middle Ages, the tomb-dwelling Saint Antony, and India's estimated 4 million sadhus, many of whom filed their own death certificates before commencing a life of monastic bliss. He does not mention Chris McCandless, the subject of John Krakauer's Into the Wild, who lasted less than 4 months after disappearing into the Alaskan taiga, but McCandless had no cabins to break into. Finkel concludes, as he began, with a theory that Knight entered the forest because there is no place for him in modern society. I wasn't content, Knight said. Before he left, he was shy, socially inept, anxious. After, he says, I was lord of the woods. Knight's hermitage was not entirely pure. He stole processed foods and a twin-size mattress, listened to talk radio, a lot of Rush Limbaugh, played handheld video games, and even watched a miniature Panasonic black and white television charged with stolen car batteries, an admission that draws into question his claim that he did not know what decade it was. And it was not easy. He had to endure Maine winters when temperatures sank to 20 degrees below Fahrenheit, pacing across his site at 2 a.m. to fend off frostbite. But the forest granted him freedom, privacy, and serenity, and it transformed his brain. He developed photographic recall, productivity for deep contemplation, a limitless attention span. One of his recent pastimes was hiking before dawn to arise and watching the fog gather in the valley. Finkel quotes a handful of scientific studies to argue that Knight's camp may have been the ideal setting to encourage maximum brain function. In her new book, The Nature Fix, about the growing field of environmental health research, the journalist Florence Williams reports on dozens of studies that find that exposure to nature is good for civilization. A few days in nature yields a 50% improvement in creativity, increases attention span, lessens hyperactivity and aggression. Proximity to the ocean correlates with one's happiness, and mortality rates drop in greener neighborhoods. Well, traffic noise increases the strain on one's heart. Put another way, our growing alienation from nature is killing us. Most people intuit that it's healthy to exercise outside, to visit a park, to walk in the forest. Poets and artists have preached these values for millennia, as have planners, at least Frederick Law Olmsted, as Williams acknowledges.
Maybe working here.